Hello, everybody. We are just letting people load up here. Nice to see you here. Hello, Victoria Lindsay. Nice to see you. Simon Waddington, thanks for waiting in reception all that time. Hello, Keith Zimmerman. I think you might have been on yesterday's one as well. Yes, I might make it a little bit longer because we had people pinging in while people were talking yesterday. So just wait a bit longer. You have arrived at the Ukraine-Britain Business Council's war briefing with University of Bath, just so you know you're in the right webinar. Okay. Okay, we did have about 30 sign up, so I'm sure more will be coming. David and Stephen, I think we might start if that's okay, because we're recording this and this will go to a wider audience beyond those that are online. So firstly, to welcome everybody here, I'm Ashley Goodall from the Ukraine-Britain Business Council. Thank you very much for coming today. I'm particularly grateful to two speakers from the University of Bath. We have Professor David Galbreath, Professor of War and Technology, PoLIS Deputy Director, and Bath Institute for Digital Security and Behaviour at the University of Bath. He's writes often about Ukraine, so he's up to speed on what's happening. Also very grateful to Dr. Stephen Hall, who's a lecturer in politics, languages and international studies at the Centre for the Study of Violence in the University of Bath. He's also an expert on Russia. Unfortunately, we were going to have Patrick Berry today talking on another aspect of military elements, but he's unfortunately unwell. However, we have two very capable speakers, and we will probably give each speaker somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes to talk. I may ask some questions. There is a chat function, so if you would like to put any questions in, please put it in the chat function, and we can go from there. So without more ado, I'd very much like David Galbraith to address the meeting and look forward to hearing from you. Effectively, we'll be looking at what's happening in Ukraine, a sort of an overview of where we are, particularly from a military point of view. And then we're going to be looking at maybe the influence and what the effect might be of Donald Trump in America. And then finally looking at what prospects are for peace and what does that mean and how you police it. So we're going right through from where we are now to hopefully some sort of ceasefire. And incidentally, yesterday we were talking with one of the ministers of Ukraine, and they were talking about the ceasefire. So we have to be hopeful that something's going to happen. Anyway, over to you, David. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ashley. So it's an interesting time to be talking about Ukraine, not only because of the prospect for changes, but what's happening in Ukraine itself. And I think November itself was a pretty destabilizing month for the Ukrainian forces. I think I've most recently heard the war, or at least the Ukrainian perspective, described in very weather terms, in that it's stable, declining slowly, and most definitely that's the way that it appears at the moment. So in November, we've seen two things really happen. We've seen some radical changes in terms of what the front line looks like, although not radical in terms of the overall number of, say, square kilometers that Russia holds, but radical in a sense that we've seen some significant changes. These changes in November itself, if you just compare it to November 2023, Russia held 17.4% of Ukrainian territory, and now after November 2024, it holds 17.9% of Russian territory. So we have seen a significant change. Most definitely, the major focus of the war, of the Russian action, has been in Donetsk. Of the four regions or oblasts that Russia occupies, at least in part, it actually holds less of Donetsk than the other. I think around 59%, of what I can remember. So that means that actually we've seen some radical, the changes that we've largely seen, we've seen mostly in Donetsk, and if you go to something like a newspaper and look at the comparison of the battles that have taken place, they're overwhelmingly in Donetsk in November. So we've seen some changes. Volodar has been captured, really held out for a very long time, and was captured. Mostly, it was captured. So this is a city in Donetsk oblast or region. It was captured really with the prospect of being surrounded, and eventually the Ukrainians, after fighting off the Russians time over time over time, eventually withdrew in that case. Russia now is going towards or is fighting very hard for Pokrovsk. This is probably the area that is probably most active at the moment. Um, Pokrovsk is really important because it's a very important for both rail and road networks, and so it's a bit of a hub for the region, and has been a way actually for the Ukrainian forces to bring material to the front line. And so loss of Pokrovsk could hurt the further defense of Donetsk region, made more difficult. Many towns have actually been conquered or captured along the way. We've seen a huge amount of, bringing citizens out to these towns, moving them further west, as is happening in Pokrovsk at the moment, where actually the city is being emptied with the prospect of a future battle over the city. Of course, a battle over a city in the Ukrainian terms means essentially really a flattening of the city, as we've seen on many occasions. So, what would be left of what would remain of Pokrovsk afterwards is a really difficult question. We've also seen a change in Toretsk, which is further north. So again, it's a big target. Towns have been taken along the way, although the area has not been seized yet. Same thing for Kharkiv, which is a target for the Russian forces. There has been operations to take more and more territory, but Kharkiv still stands and remains in Ukrainian hands. Lugansk is probably the area that is having the least operations. This is because Russia already holds something like 98% of the Lugansk region, so the change is probably not that great. So the question that has been posed in many cases is, what kind of land is Russia taking? So if Russia is making an advance and moving, as we see, from 17.4% to 17.9%, what is really changing hands? Many of the skeptics have said that actually, yes, we can see that Russia is spending a lot of resource, and in fact, a lot of resource in taking this territory. But in fact, that it's been taking it, and what it has got actually is largely farmland. So with the prospect that actually it doesn't necessarily aid the Russian war effort in any way, but at the same time looks particularly damaging, at least in public relations, in terms of where we see Ukraine at the moment. So we understand that actually, if we're thinking about the future and what that would mean, that the Russian every bit of every meter that Russia is able to take, for instance, could go into the negotiation. So let me not go into that at this stage, and let me just tell you a bit more about the war itself. So we've seen that UAVs have really almost kind of really taken over the character of the war in Ukraine. At the moment, the Ukrainians have an advantage in terms of their UAV production. Something like in 2024, something like 1.3 million drones were created or manufactured in Ukraine. There's a huge, especially the navigation systems is something that is being bought and generated by companies like Honeywell and others. That is being, there's a huge number of navigation systems going into Ukraine. Interestingly enough, what the big changes in UAVs, which is happening at the moment, is what's called FPV drones. So you will know these in many cases because they're recreational drones, but these are first-person viewer drones. And the reason why these are particularly useful is because the Russians have been quite good in across the different frequencies of being able to jam drones or jam UAVs. So in order to confuse their navigation systems. So all of a sudden, if you've got a drone that actually doesn't have a geolocation system and also doesn't have a stabilization system, so it doesn't really have a navigation system because it's being essentially driven over about a 15 kilometer period or space is being driven by an individual with a mask on who can see exactly what the drone sees, then that's being really quite impactful. So amazing things have happened in terms of using them in terms of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, otherwise known as ISR. Targeting, so replacing humans and being able to target, especially with the somewhat nascent Ukrainian Air Force, but also other types of munitions as we've seen. The increase, the other thing that we've seen as an increase is what is called tethered drones. And tethered really is what it says it is instead, but they're tethered by essentially Ethernet cables. So what we see is Ethernet cables are being bought up and used, and basically you plug one sided Ethernet cable into the drone, it flies off essentially dragging this Ethernet cable over treetops and can go. I think the longest Ethernet cable, something is like, several kilometers, which is really quite amazing. They're relatively cheap actually to produce. And what that allows also to happen is that you get very good data, right? Because it's connected, it's wired, if you will. And the other issue is that actually you have a very good connection to the drone, and so you don't have to worry about frequency jamming, which is what the Russians are trying to do. And of course, what's happening between the Ukrainian and Russian forces is they're constantly, in a sense, changing and flipping their frequencies. So the Ukrainians will send some drones out one day on a certain frequencies. The Russians will pick it up and change to that frequency in terms to jam it the next day. The Ukrainians try to change, and there's just constantly a cat and mouse game. The interesting thing is that, and I think this is really important. Many of the things that the Ukrainians have, such as mortar fire and things like that, in order to target a Russian front line, mean that you actually have to get close. So mortar fire can be somewhere around, depending on the mortar, but it's something like 800 meters or 1.2 kilometers or something like that. And all of a sudden, if you've got something that can actually drop munition 15 kilometers away, that really is quite an advantage that Ukraine has at the moment. Russia is also using, of course, drones, and we see the introduction or not the introduction, but the continued use of drones such as the Iranian-made Shahed drones that have really been a character of the war since the very beginning. There have been reports of even more, in a sense, kind of destructive drones or dummy drones or constant 24-hour drone attacks that are happening, especially against Ukrainian infrastructure. But what we know in Russia's case, and I'll come to nearer an end here, is that it's experiencing a huge amount of losses. It's expected that it lost somewhere around 45,000 troops in November alone. That's a huge number. The ability for Russia to continue to recruit forces into its army, even if it is recruiting from Pakistan, India, in some cases further afield. Not to mention, using a lot of minority communities in Russia itself. It's just essentially not able to recruit at that level. And at the moment, we don't have a national call up or mobilization in Russia. So manpower is increasingly a problem, but of course, manpower has been and perpetually is a problem for the Ukrainians at the same time. Ukraine has said that it will not call up 18-year-olds to the war, for instance, at least not at the moment. So what does this mean in terms of, how what's happening going further? What we do know is that Russia is in very bad financial shape, that it's using huge amount of its budget. We do know that there was a run on banks recently. There's a problem with its currency, that Chinese banks have just cut Russian banks out of its system. Chinese banks refuse to do work with, because it's a risk. There's no political moment, incentive, but there is a risk in dealing with Russian banks at the moment. What we've not seen also is that North Korean troops have not entered into the fray. There have been reports of North Korean injuries, but actually these were injuries because essentially their barracks were bombed through ATACMS, essentially targeting. So, but we don't have any claims of North Korean troops openly, engaging in combat with the Ukrainians. There's definitely a lot of activity happening in the Kursk region of Russia, of which Ukraine is now is occupied, but we've not seen much change in that. In addition to no North Korean troops entering into combat. I would say that that's really a consequence of the United States and Britain, for that matter, escalating the use of something like the ATACMS or the Storm Shadows beyond the Ukrainian border. So Russia has basically said, okay, I understand that you're responding to this in terms of internationalizing the conflict because we brought North Korean troops into it. So what we'll do is that we'll keep them out of the conflict for now, and therefore we're de-escalating as far as that's concerned. And that's a very interesting thing that has happened, I believe. So the future in and of itself is a very interesting thing. And we imagine if the war continues to go on, all the things that I've mentioned so far would continue to rumble on as both challenges and really, in a sense, the way of the conflict itself. The big change that, of course, is happening is the election of Donald Trump into his second presidency, and he comes into that role in January 2025. And we imagine that actually this could have a potentially huge change or challenge as the Americans have been really fundamental in terms of their both material and diplomatic aid to Ukraine during these last 1,000 and something days now. So I suspect that really we should imagine a change of some sort. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. By the way, everybody, if you'd like to put questions in the chat, feel free to do so. May I just ask a couple of things, David? One is, do you think Putin's trying to create buffer zones by dead cities in between him and Ukraine? That's the first thing in the West. And the second thing, would you sort of characterize this as a frozen conflict in a sense? I know that Russia making gains in certain areas, but is that the general sense of where we are? I'm not getting a sense of collapse of Ukraine, even though people may be weary.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's a buffer zone for the Russians necessarily, because they are the aggressor. So I'm not sure what they're buffering themselves from in this case. Um, do we imagine that they would be particularly concerned about the idea of, say, Western troops arriving into Ukraine and therefore wanting to put distance between it and them? Possibly, but I suspect that probably that's not the case. I think what the Russians are doing is really trying to fulfill what they said that they wanted to fulfill. Crimea plus these four oblasts and really anything else in addition to that that they could hold and go into a negotiation with is probably a good thing. The challenge I think for the Ukrainians is any negotiation that happens at the moment really puts them on the back foot because they're losing territory at the moment. So you really want to go into negotiation, and I'm really worried about stealing Stephen's thunder here. You really want to go into a negotiation in the advance. So I think that's but I take your point around the frozen conflicts probably even more seriously, and this is something that I've worked on a lot over the years, and Russia has used frozen conflicts as a way as to, in a sense, to apply pressure and to ease pressure at different times, and really to no one's benefit, it seems to me, other than Russia's. So if you look at Nagorno-Karabakh, which was a frozen conflict, Russia couldn't stop Azerbaijan from eventually retaking it, running out the Armenians, despite the fact that Armenia was ostensibly an ally of Russia. Transnistria in Moldova continues to be a really rough place to live and really a difficult place with part of the Russian army sitting there as well. It's essentially a puppet state to the Russians in that case. You also have Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia, which again, Russia can apply pressure when it needs to. Of course, the things that are happening in Georgia at the moment suggest that Russia actually doesn't need to worry about those frozen conflicts at the moment. They can remain frozen for now. So yes, it is a position. Ukraine definitely doesn't want to put itself in the position of actually having these frozen conflicts. And what was interesting in the case of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania when they sought to join both the EU and NATO in 2004 is they were very quick and very keen to agree their borders with the Russian Federation, even to a point to where so that Russia would have no claims on them whatsoever. So if that meant giving over territory, so be it. Let us be finished with this. And I suspect Ukraine is in a very similar position.
Thank you very much, David. Excellent. So, Stephen, over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ashley, and thank you, David. I'd just like to, now start with the idea of the frozen conflict. I don't think, at least from the official rhetoric coming from the Kremlin, that they're looking for a frozen conflict now. They seem to be focused on the idea of these are historic Russian territories. These are Russia. Sergei Kirienko, the domestic curator of the presidential administration in Russia, regularly goes to Donetsk and Luhansk and is open about the fact that these are now Russia. It's something I don't think they necessarily want a frozen conflict scenario, because at least officially they're fed up with what happened in Minsk and allegedly the West's nefarious practices regarding the Minsk agreements, and the fact that Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande and Emmanuel Macron failed to force Ukraine to give up what the Kremlin wanted. Now, in terms of the negotiations, the further down the line, it's a very tricky position at the moment for Ukraine, as David has certainly explained particularly well. And it's very difficult in terms of being able to negotiate from a position of weakness. Putin historically has seen the other side calling for negotiations as weakness, and therefore has been able historically to push for more than he actually was willing to actually get away with. So if Ukraine is pushed into negotiations, as seems plausible at the moment, then it's going to be very difficult for for Ukraine to get anything comprehensive out of this. We can see in terms of what Putin and the Kremlin are saying, they're still maintaining their maximalist approach, the idea of Ukraine having to accept the Istanbul agreements, because at least in the Kremlin's propaganda, those agreements were signed. The very idea that Ukraine would remain neutral in perpetuity, that the Ukrainian army would be reduced to 60,000 men, it wouldn't be able to have missiles that could fire more than 40 kilometers, it was to be reduced to 342 tanks. I don't know why the Kremlin was so specific about 342, but that's the number they gave. And that Ukraine was going to, that other countries could intervene in supporting Ukraine, but Russia had a veto over those countries' intervention. And this was the Istanbul Agreement a la Putin. And so the assumption is that, at least in the rhetoric, this is what Russia wants. Plus, what is already existing, the facts on the ground that we see today, that Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, even though Russia doesn't control them, they are now Russian. The Ukrainians have to man up and accept it, and they can move their forces out of these territories, which are now Russian. In terms of what we're seeing, what else we're seeing, the very idea that we can see Donald Trump talking about these multiple plans for negotiations, all depends on which Donald Trump appears in the room on the day and which plan actually materializes. From what we can see, it does seem to be that Putin or Russia will be told to start talking. The Ukrainians will also be told to start talking. We started seeing Zelensky actually saying, well, you know, ideally we'd like to return to the 1992 borders, but this may not be possible. We are happy to begin negotiations, and eventually we will get back Ukrainian territory diplomatically from Russia in the future. So Ukraine is already starting to talk about negotiations. Putin, I think, is still maintaining his maximist approach in the hope that he can have the whole cake. And the rest of it is, it seems to be for Donald Trump, that there will be a demilitarized zone that will be filled with peacekeepers. It's still up to interpretation as to where those peacekeepers will come from, and that Ukraine will be neutral for 20 years. I think that was the number that was being thrown around. The problem is, for me at least, that I can't imagine that the Kremlin, having fought a war for in part, along with the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, to have Ukraine neutral and consistently talking about this in its narratives, that Ukraine has to be neutral in perpetuity, is going to allow the idea of Ukraine possibly joining NATO in 20 years' time. Of course, NATO, like the European Union, has kicked the can of Ukrainian membership down the road for many years, so it may continue to do so for another 20 or 40. But the point is that Russia, under Putin at least, is not going to allow that. The next question is, what does one do with the peacekeepers? I suspect there seem to be three options. From what I can see, the United Nations, Russia has a veto at the Security Council. It can control that process if the United Nations were to send peacekeepers. If they didn't do what Russia wanted, then it would be easier for the Kremlin to stymie those. The Kremlin also has a long history of using the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in a particular way. And so, having seen what the OSCE failed to do in terms of bringing about or preserving the peace during the interregnum, if you want to call it that, the war in Ukraine began in 2014, but the hot stage started again in 2022. So the cold peace, Russia made sure the OSCE was weak. The idea of having the OSCE as a peacekeeping mission, I don't think necessarily is something that Russia may be looking at. We've seen Sergei Lavrov going to Malta yesterday, so that may be something they're trying to get over the line. And the other option is peacekeepers from different places. We could have the Commonwealth for Security, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, I do apologize, and be implementing peacekeepers from Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Armenia. There is no way the Ukrainian government is going to accept that. On the other hand, we've had talk of Western countries getting involved in terms of acting as peacekeepers, working on the demilitarized lines. I can't imagine that Russia is going to be particularly happy about the idea of so-called unfriendly NATO countries being on the demilitarized line, wherever that will be in Ukraine, this hypothetical idea. So it is very much a difficult situation in terms of where the negotiations and the ceasefire are going to come. We have, from my own understanding, as I said, the Kremlin does feed off weakness, and if it perceives that Ukraine and its Western backers are weak in terms of their negotiation stance, then it will try to get as much as it can in terms of its maximist approaches. We've seen Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, along with others fairly recently in the West, talking about supplying Ukraine with the weapons to get it to a position of strength. That remains very hard for European countries to do alone. And so it does depend on which Donald Trump appears in the White House and whether Vladimir Putin will try his hardest to hide his, I think, expansionist ideas regarding Ukraine behind a facade in terms of trying to convince the Americans that he is willing to negotiate. That may be something they try and do in order to stop the Americans from continuing to supply Ukraine. Joe Biden did talk about sending $50 billion worth of aid recently, I believe, and I've forgotten his name because I can't suddenly have a mind block, but the Republican leader of the Senate did say that's not going to happen yesterday. That won't happen until Donald Trump becomes president of America, and it probably won't happen afterwards. So it is certainly, I think, a difficult situation for Ukraine at the moment, and there really is, in my opinion, very little in terms of a viable ceasefire if this situation continues. The only viable ceasefire is to be able to give Ukraine what it needs to win this war. That should have happened in 2022. And what I mean by winning the war is not returning to 1992. That could have happened, but it isn't. Winning the war is getting Ukraine to be able to a position of strength to be able to negotiate from that position. And that, I think, remains or should remain the task of the West. It's now a very difficult discussion that needs to be said with Western governments as to how they can actually achieve that. That's my 2 pennies worth.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. Just a quick thing to bear in mind, just the wider Russian world seems to be under a bit of pressure at the moment in Syria, potentially in Georgia. It's not going swimmingly, and even the Chinese may not be entirely happy with what's going on with North Korea. Could you take a slightly broader view of Russia at the moment? I mean, are they quite happy with what's happening, or is the strain going to show at some stage?
Well, I think the strain is already showing. Elvira Nabiulina, the head of the central bank, said yesterday that the inflation rate, the interest rate, key interest rate is going up from 21% to 22, possibly 23, possibly even 24 if the economy continues. Russia is under strain. Unfortunately, Vladimir Putin does not really mind too much about the economy because it isn't leading to mass protests. We've seen that the new budget coming out of Russia is going to be 6.8% to the military and the security services. That doesn't account for the secret parts of the budget, and that's 40%, if my memory serves me correctly, is what Russia is already spending, is going on the military or security. We've seen as well that Media Zona announced, back in November, that 79,812 Russians have died in this war. That was in November, and so in December we can assume it's over 80,000 by now. And we've seen in terms of the numbers being killed daily, 1,500 if my memory serves me correctly. And also in terms of different republics, Bashkortostan and Tatarstan have the biggest numbers. Putin is not too worried about deaths. He's not too worried about deaths coming from the ethnic republics as well. In fact, it benefits him because it weakens their possible splitism, if you want to call it that. So I think in terms of the wider issues as well, in terms of Syria, yes, it doesn't look good, certainly. But I don't know if and David will be able to speak more on this, I don't know whether the Russian military has the capacity to fight effectively on two fronts to prop up Bashar al-Assad yet again. That would need quite a bit, I would say, in terms of men and material into Syria. In terms of Africa, it seems to be doing a fairly effective job of maintaining those regimes. And I wouldn't necessarily say that's a problem, but certainly in regards to the Middle East, the conflagration that is occurring in the Middle East at the moment has put Russia in a difficult bind because it needs to support Iran, it needs to support the Houthis in Yemen. And obviously what's happening in Syria. And if we are to believe the president of South Korea that there was apparently going to be a coup by the opposition with the support of North Korea, that could potentially also lead to a spiral on the Korean Peninsula, and Russia now has a treaty where it is obliged to support North Korea. So it is a problem, I think, for the Kremlin at the moment that they are fighting a war in Ukraine, and it's taken them a lot longer to achieve what they wanted to do. And now other toxic powers, other events that Russia has played a big role in are also starting to affect it. And I think this will be increasingly challenging for Putin to maintain. But his fixation will always remain on Ukraine. I think that's quite clear. Ukraine has always been the hill that he is willing to die on. He will do his utmost to keep the Russian bases in Syria, but I don't expect that there will be a significant change in terms of supporting the Syrians. The Russian Air Force is still there. They will offer the air power, but it's up to the Syrians and possibly the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to be the ground soldiers in this. But David will be able to say more about the military side.
And just one more question, if I may. There's 300 billion or more possibly sitting in frozen Russian accounts, easy access if things don't happen. Is that even a consideration for Putin? Does he even bother about that?
I think to an extent, at least from from reading the Russian elites, from what the Russian elites are saying, they already believe they've lost it. Now, they might be able to try and they might hope to get access to it again in the near future. If that is part of the negotiations, that may be raised. But I think there is this assumption that has been lost, at least for the near future. I don't think it necessarily worries Putin too much. I think that at the moment it is, as I say, Ukraine is the hill he's willing to die on, and that is more important to him in terms of what he wants to achieve.
There's a question here from Christopher Clements about Russia's expansionist aims. If negotiated settlement is reached, what's the likelihood Russia will eventually just try to ignore it?
Well, I think there is a strong possibility that Russia will continue to ignore if it doesn't fit in with Vladimir Putin's ideas, if it doesn't fit in with even who comes after Vladimir Putin. We don't know. I think that there is this very real possibility that the expansion of Russia is always considered in the Kremlin. Now, we can't possibly say in terms of whether they would actually break the negotiations, but they will find ways around the negotiations. They will try to blur the lines. They will try to weaken Ukraine's resolve and the resolve of the West to support Ukraine for however long it takes to reconstruct Ukraine and to make it a viable military power that can defend itself. Russia has been very effective at maintaining those lines, as it were, in terms of blurring what has actually been said, and has used that very effectively in the past. It was always, I mean, whilst Russian propaganda will lay the blame at Angela Merkel for her comment that Minsk was just a way to give us time to arm the Ukrainians, Vladislav Surkov, the curator of Ukraine for the Kremlin, the presidential administration, was also very open about it, that Minsk was meant to be unworkable from the Russian perspective in order to make it easier for Russia to intervene in Ukraine when it felt it needed to. So I can imagine this will certainly continue even if the war is negotiated. The Ukrainian negotiators and their Western supporters need to be very clear and very firm about what the terms will be, and they will be tested by the Kremlin.
The other thing is that Mykola Kuzmin is just mentioning about what's the likelihood if Ukraine stays outside of NATO, it might develop its own nuclear bomb, a little simplistic device, a dirty device, for example. Do you think there's a possibility? They've been talking about it.
Oh, it's good to hear. It's good to hear from Nicola. I hope he's well. They certainly have been talking about a nuclear bomb, or at least that came up. I think it was in the Financial Times recently, in terms of Ukraine working towards a dirty bomb. If Ukraine was to go down that route, then I think it would lose a lot of support in the West, amongst Western states who don't want to have another nuclear power and one that is likely to use that nuclear bomb if push comes to shove. So I don't think it's something that the Ukrainian regime seriously considers. I could be wrong on this, and I'm sure Mykola knows more about it than I do. But my understanding would be that at the moment, that isn't really something the Ukrainians are considering. In terms of Ukraine being outside NATO, we'll have to see if that does occur, and certainly from reports coming out that Germany, Hungary, and America are not considering the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, then we have to see what security guarantees are given to NATO. If we're talking about the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, where France, America, and Britain will send a strongly worded letter to Russia if it ever intervenes, that isn't sufficient for Ukraine here and now. So we'll have to see what security guarantees are offered. That will likely involve an attack on Ukraine, will involve British, German, Polish, whichever country signed security guarantee, actually getting involved. And that will have to be very clearly made to the Kremlin, very clear to the Kremlin as a signal, and the support for rebuilding the Ukrainian military will also have to be very clear as a signal to the Kremlin.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen. I'll give you a breather. David, would you like to come in and say anything in relation to what you've heard, and has it stimulated you for further observations?
Well, I mean, the first thing about Ukraine and nuclear weapons, let me just say that Ukraine is a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and so therefore it would violate its own signatory of the treaty and ratification of the treaty to acquire nuclear weapons, and it would be essentially participating in nuclear proliferation, and so therefore I don't think that that's really in anyone's interests. Much less you could imagine that Russia would escalate even further in terms of its ability to stop that from happening. So I think that would be really a terrible idea. In fact, the one thing that I wanted to say or mention also is this idea that of Russia being on the back foot. And I think that actually Nagorno-Karabakh was a good example of how Russia was on the back foot in that case. But as we both see in Nagorno-Karabakh and in Syria, and to some degree also in Ukraine, is that of the role of Turkey in being essentially a balancing actor in relation to Russia. And really, the Russian Federation doesn't have an answer to a resurgent Turkey in any way, which is really fascinating. I mean, and even today, we have two Russian naval ships leaving Latakia and returning to Russian ports. So already, there is. I mean, I wouldn't say the Russians are running home, but they understand that that things are difficult at the moment. We also see that actually Russian forces, as they are in sub-Saharan Africa, Chad, and Central African Republic, just to name two, are under increasing pressure from those governments because essentially the Russians are just not following the rules as far as they're concerned, and are making things worse. And so Russia is in a difficult position. Which brings me actually to the question I think that was posed around this idea of whether or not the frozen conflicts really benefit Russia or not. And I would say that actually in international politics, every action comes with risk. So I don't think that there's probably a risk-free action in any way. But we do see that actually it is meant that that Russia, as much as it would like to use these for its own means, actually it's not been able to do that much with them. In fact, even to the point to where you only needed the U.S. Navy to show up in the Black Sea for Russia to go home in northern Georgia in 2008. So there's really not a feeling that these frozen conflicts can deliver that much for Russia any longer. But that doesn't mean that those in the former Soviet Union aren't continually thinking about the prospect of another frozen conflict. It still has a Soviet legacy to it that makes a lot of states uncomfortable in this region. And so, it's not only Ukraine, but I'm sure other states like Kazakhstan and even Belarus would be thinking the same thing.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. I was going to ask you a question, but someone else has put something in here about more about the specifics about the weakening of the Russian economy. Chinese banks closing off dealings with Russian ones. I mean, is that they're worried about sanctions from America, or are actually sanctions and the closing down of the Russian economy really starting to bite? And if that were to continue for another 6 months to a year, that could possibly have quite an impact.
Yeah, I mean, it could. I mean, what we know about sanctions is that the longer they go on, the least effective they are. So, so that means that actually, do we imagine that things are going to hurt Russia even more so? They do have a lot of opportunity, especially through India, and being able to essentially to go around the sanctions. So at the moment, India is a very interesting conduit for trade into Russia. I think the biggest problem is the financial sector in Russia as a whole. So not necessarily just hurting consumers in Russia, but actually in the case of the financial sector, whether or not being part of SWIFT, for instance, do your credit cards still work in Russia, for instance? Do you have the ability to borrow money any longer? Or so what is credit like? What is currency flow like? Things like this that I think that are not the most interesting aspects of the conflict in any way, but actually probably are hurting Russia more than anything else.
Thank you. There's one other question here, which is I'm just going to preface with, we saw Prigozhin zoom up to Moscow almost unchallenged. And that might imply that behind the front lines, there's not a lot going on. There's a question here that says, from Victoria Lindsay, what will be the scenario if Putin dies or is assassinated or deposed?
Can I step in just briefly in terms of the economy, and then I can answer that, or David can. Yes, Russia is finding ways around the sanctions through Kazakhstan and Turkey and Armenia, but it takes a lot to get not necessary technology in that way. It's in terms of the oil and gas, India.
I think we're frozen here. We're in a frozen conflict situation.
Being able to get that.
Sorry, Stephen, my screen is frozen then. It might be others. Could you just say in terms of tech? Yeah, sorry.
I don't know where I finished. Before.
You were just about to say India.
Oh, right, okay, fine. India is certainly taking a lot of oil and gas from Russia. There are two problems with that. Russia doesn't have many eastern facing pipelines in terms of gas and oil, and getting that technology generally came from the West. Being able to tap new oil fields in the north remains a challenge. Also, one of the things is that one of the reasons why Russia was talking about the de-dollarization with the BRICS, that hasn't happened because the other BRICS members don't necessarily want to de-dollarize. They don't want to find an alternative. But also, more importantly, the Indians are paying for their oil and gas in rupees. and it isn't being converted into rubles. So Russia effectively is giving it for free. So I don't necessarily, in terms of daily consumer variables, we're seeing the prices of eggs and bread, if my memory serves me correctly, bread has gone up by 70% in terms of the costs, eggs as well, milk, various commodities. And it is, I would say, sanctions are biting. Now, of course, sanctions take time. Of course, countries can work around them. And that, I'm sure the Russian economy is going to be very adaptive. It's one of the reasons why they've been so close recently to Iran, because Iran has had a long history of finding ways around Western sanctions. So it is very much a cat and mouse game, but I think sanctions are having an effect on the Russian economy. Now, for my 2 pence worth in terms of what happens if Putin dies and is assassinated or deposed, I mean, anything could happen in terms of that. It depends exactly on what the scenario is with Putin being assassinated or deposed. Is it a protest a la 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, or is it someone in the inner circle simply deciding that Vladimir Putin needs to learn how to fly and goes out of a window? That sort of thing. So it certainly depends in regards to that, but without, my prediction has always been that we never see protests until they actually happen. So it's easier to say in regards to the Kremlin that what comes after Putin will be very similar to Putin. And that's something I think the Western states have to be prepared for. That yes, they should have a plan for the future of Russia, whatever, and develop that plan as to what happens when Vladimir Putin does depart this mortal coil or is moved to Sochi or where have you. But what comes after Putin will most likely be from within the regime. And that is very much, I think, much more of the same. The West has to be prepared not to do its traditional thing when it comes to Russian politics of believing that who comes into the presidency in the Kremlin is somehow liberal, is somehow pro-Western. It did the same with Putin in 2000. It definitely did the same with Medvedev in 2008. Here was a young man who could use an iPad, and shock horror, he must be pro-Western. And as we've seen in regards to what Medvedev has been saying since 2022, it was clearly a facade. So, yeah, I think there's certainly this, the Western governments need to be ready for what comes after Putin, but they also need to stop living the same circle every time, that when the new leader comes into power in Russia, they are somehow going to be completely different to the previous leadership. That's my opinion. I don't know if David has something to add there.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is so interesting. I think we could go on with all sorts of circular questions here. I'm probably going to call an end now. Firstly, to say you've in the chat, you've got your latest article here in the conversation. So if anybody wants to read that, that'd probably be a very good guide for them. Secondly, if you'd like to just sort of summarize where you think we are and what's going to happen in fairly short term. I think you've said it a few times, but it'd be good just to hear your distilled thoughts. And anything you'd like to say about the University of Bath, if you're doing special talks or courses you're running, sort of thing people might like to check into.
Yeah, shall I go first, Stephen? So the first thing to say is what I think is going to happen. We know that new landmines are coming to Ukraine. We imagine that this is going to be an increasingly important part to the Ukrainian defense. Russia is making advances through what is essentially small fire teams. These fire teams actually are really hard to detect. There are many of them, and essentially they're crossing across lines. And Ukraine is especially spread thin. And I think that if you look at all the ways that Russia attacked Ukrainian forces in November, you can see that actually it did it really all the way down. And that's very difficult for the Ukrainians. So it's going to continue to use that. I think actually having a mild winter in Ukraine just is probably not ideal for anyone, but especially not for the Ukrainians. So that's something to also bear in mind of what's likely to happen in the next few months.
Thank you very much. Stephen?
Well, in terms of the military situation, I think David has hit the nail on the head. It's going to be a relatively long and drawn out, I suspect, in terms of what's going to happen. We may start to see talks about negotiations in the near future. The Western states will still spend a lot of time, I think, in the near future talking about what they actually plan to do in regards to supporting Ukraine. Yes, weapons will come through, but they will still be in dribs and drabs. In my opinion, Ukraine has always been given enough to defend itself, but never to win. And I think that will continue for a while longer. It all depends, and I think we're all just waiting on Donald Trump and when he's inaugurated and what is going to be the plan because the European states have spent, and it's all right saying, hindsight is 2020, but there was always a possibility that Donald Trump could, or someone similar to him, could return to the American presidency. And European states have spent the last 4 years navel gazing, in my opinion. They haven't been prepared, and that becomes increasingly difficult in terms of what to do without America. So I think we're very much waiting for Donald Trump to be inaugurated and seeing what comes next.
Thank you very much indeed. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for logging on. I'd particularly like to thank Professor David Galbreath from the University of Bath, and thank you also, Dr. Stephen Hall from the University of Bath. What a great place. Thank you very much for your insights. I will be putting this online or sharing it with people so you can access it and share it with your colleagues. And the other thing is, if anybody would like to join Ukraine-Britain Business Council, please let me know. We're open for business and we're growing quietly. We have some interesting members and waiting for things to be easier in Ukraine. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. And with that, Slava Ukraine.